Welcome. Let's begin with the meditation. Begin by settling in, becoming more present. Allowing your body and mind to relax more, opening, feeling the movement of your breath. With each breath, becoming more present. Letting everything else go. With each in-breath, drawing in light, pure white light. See the light filling your body. Bringing in vitality and peace. And with each out-breath, releasing negativity, stress, concerns. Seeing your whole body filled with light, gently growing stronger. And see the light extending around your body, forming a shell, an energy field of white light, surrounding and permeating your body. repeating to yourself, may my body be healthy and strong. May my feelings be peaceful and content. May my mind be calm and illuminated. May peace prevail on earth. May love prevail on earth. May all beings awaken. Feel yourself grounded in your body, yet open and calm. And when ready, open your eyes. Well, I've received a fair amount of feedback, suggestions about themes people would like to explore in this webinar. But perhaps the theme that's most commonly brought up is, of course, the world situation. And so I thought I would begin by jumping into that one. Of course, it's a huge topic. We could do multiple webinars just on that theme. So I've spent some time reflecting on what aspects to zero in on. And one of the themes that stands out most to me in my own experience and when I'm talking with others is, especially in a spiritual context, is the fact that many of us have resonated with some kind of a sense over the years that there's some kind of spiritual awakening happening in the world, some kind of transformational experience, some kind of emergent new spirituality, a new age even, of some sort. In fact, in my own early stages of becoming interested in spirituality in this life, those were some of the forms that I encountered first were actually, and we're on to, were those types, which was a shift for me because in my teens, I really wasn't that optimistic about the world situation, even in the late 60s and early 70s. I can remember feeling pretty disturbed about the world situation. I mean, at that time, the arms race was on everybody's mind, and certainly a growing awareness of ecological concerns and so on. So I was actually kind of a somewhat cynical teenager, disappointed with humanity. But I started to go through a spiritual awakening beginning in my late teens, and part of that was I became more optimistic, saw the better side of human nature more, saw more hope in the situation. But at the same time, having an aspect of my nature being kind of the scientist, I knew people studying science or with scientific and technological orientations. So there was a lot of awareness there too of kind of looking at the facts of the world situation. I had friends that were at places like MIT working on models of the world situation and the concerns about our current civilization, how sustainable is our modern industrial civilization, especially with its current sort of the foundations of that culture being one of sort of limitless progress and tremendous consumption of resources. It's not a very holistic or wise or sustainable model. So there was a lot of awareness at that time, and I was attuned to that. And at the same time, not only was I encountering these kinds of teachings, but as my own intuition awakened more deeply, and I started having deeper meditative experiences and visionary experiences in day-to-day life and in dreams, I was having a kind of a spectrum of experiences, but some of them were certainly of a powerful insight into and growing understanding of some kind of spiritual awakening happening in the world. And that ultimately led during the 1980s, particularly beginning in the 80s, to a kind of puzzle. Because on the one hand, from a more grounded point of view, there were all these concerns. And on the other hand, I was having these deeper intuitions. I was contacting people and reading material and having my own visionary states that also had this other dimension to it, this more positive, more optimistic dimension. So in a sense, for me, part of my whole spiritual journey with regard to my sense of the world situation has been working with integrating these different perspectives. One way that I've kind of grown to appreciate that is looking at it, in a sense, from the chakra point of view. And it's kind of like the chakras represent within our own nature. You know, of course, each chakra, as I've suggested in the past, is capable of being illuminated and transformed in such a way that all of the chakras make a positive and equal contribution to our spiritual nature and manifestation. But in ordinary human experience, in some ways, the chakras below the heart tend to normally have a stronger attunement to the subconscious part of our nature. You know, our consciousness tends to be sort of in the upper area of our body in ordinary awareness. And the lower chakras often kind of have this more like memories and deeper impulses and repressed emotions and instinctual desires and so on. Not that these are inherently evil or negative, but they're kind of more limited states. The fact actually is that even in our higher chakras, we have ignorance and attachments and confusion. So it's not as though higher chakras are better, but with regard to what we're more conscious of, there's a way that humans kind of relate to their manifest in their chakras, where their more conscious self is here and their shadow is in the lower chakras to some extent. So in a sense, what I found was that a lot of times, if I was more attuned to facing the truth, not just fears or a kind of heaviness there, but really kind of using these centers as a way of tuning to aspects of the world too, not just my own human nature, aspects of my own human nature, but the world around me, other people, humanity at large, the world situation. It's as if each chakra is like a point of view. You can look out at the world and attune to the world and get a perspective. So if you're very much, say, a solar plexus person, you're going to kind of see the world in terms of competition and assertiveness and power issues and emotional reactions. And where, for instance, if you tend to be more heady, the world looks like a different place. There's variations on that. It's not necessarily an inherently positive point of view, but it can be a somewhat idealistic point of view. It's kind of like these are the dimensions of the actual, the manifest, and these can be dimensions of possibilities, of ideals, of potentials. So if we attune to these dimensions, we're more likely to have visionary states of what's possible, possible futures, potentials within humanity and the world, for instance. So one way I began to understand the issues of understanding the world situation was that we really kind of need an all chakra perspective. That very often what I was noticing that I was encountering in myself at different moments in time or in different people when I would, say, read a book about some theme, is that often it was a partial point of view. It was like, we could say, some chakras were involved in that perspective and not other chakras. One basic version of that being that, especially this, I've encountered this everywhere once I became, very involved in spirituality, but certainly it's particularly evident in places like Mount Shasta, where there's a very strong kind of New Age community. Is very often I began to notice that people in the New Age communities kind of lived in their upper centers and weren't really inhabiting these chakras, didn't understand that aspect of their own nature as well, and tended to project on the world as well. They didn't see the full karmic situation of humanity, the challenges that we face. They tended to, and I have moments in myself certainly where I would emphasize that aspect as well. So there's a challenge of integration, challenge of kind of owning your whole humanity. It's like in a sense, we see the world that we understand, like knowing ourselves and how we experience ourselves and how integrated and whole we are as human beings is the measure of how we understand the reality around us. We will kind of, our own psychology, our own state of consciousness, our own level of realization, and the nature of that consciousness is the mirror on which we reflect our understanding of the world. So if we come from a place that's overly kind of, as some people might want to call it, realistic, practical, feet on the ground, etc., those perspectives will tend to emphasize kind of very often I think we find people who are particularly inclined to, say, the business world or even the political world. One of the reasons that people in politics, I think, so often don't really have a problem with not being entirely ethical is because their philosophy is kind of earthy, and a negative version of that is, well, this is just how it is. Stop being idealistic. Stop being a bleeding heart. None of that's real. That's ungrounded idealism. The reality is it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's social Darwinism. It's the survival of the fittest. And if you don't understand that, you're ignorant, you're ungrounded, you're unrealistic. Just play the game as nature created it. We're all just a bunch of fancy animals, and do your best to get what you want and make coalitions of power to consolidate your ability to do that. That's life. Anything else is fantasy. Your average politician or business person isn't always going to just come right out and say that. Some of them do. And some of the philosophies that such people are attracted to explicitly say these kinds of things. So it's not that thinly veiled anymore that a lot of people think this way. And I would argue that there's a certain truth to what they're saying, in the sense that that is a way, that is part of life. There is a state of consciousness that's like that. That doesn't mean it has to be that way. It's not a very wise way to live, in my opinion, but it is valid to acknowledge that there is a dimension of reality in the human kingdom and in the rest of the universe, where beings operate in that state of consciousness. And if we don't see that in ourselves and in each other, then we're kind of out of touch with part of the picture. We're not facing part of the karmic truth of where's the world at? Where am I at? Where's humanity at? And what is the nature of samsara? It's part of the total picture. It's like we live in a multi-story house and we have to be aware of what's going on in some of the floors. Some of them are like that. Some of them are very heavy, hellish type realms and vibrations, which exist both as subtle worlds that exist in the universe, as well as they spill over and express through each of us to varying extents and collectively in the human kingdom as well. So part of what I found in my own journey is the more I faced those realms, as well as opened up more expanded levels of consciousness, more spiritual dimensions to my nature, started to have a more whole perspective, a more multidimensional perspective. And part of that is sort of, could be called, to use the Jungian term, facing the shadow, facing the dark side of oneself, one's human nature, and subsequently the world situation. And of course, that began for me, in my teens. I didn't have a very wise way of relating to it, but I was kind of aware of that side to some extent. And then that kept deepening. And that's been an important part of seeing a kind of whole picture. Subsequently, what I've come to feel as a result of that is that we really have a very complicated situation in the world, because in a sense, there's multiple stories going on at the same time. There isn't just one story. In one sense, there's one humanity, so there's one story, there's one planet, so there's one planetary story. But at the same time, as individuals, we can participate in multiple stories, sub-stories at the same time. For instance, we all are part of a world situation in which our current civilization is in a crisis. If we're not aware of that, we're kind of in a state of denial, I think. I think that the evidence of that is growing all the time, that we're in this a challenging situation in a variety of ways. I used to, back in the 80s for a while, I used to buy a book every year that was put together by a team of scientists, social scientists, especially physical scientists, ecologists, and so on. And it was called State of the World, and it had usually each year there was a bunch of different chapters, mostly scientific papers in different areas, looking at facets of the world situation, things like population growth, ecological issues, climate change, and so on. There's quite a few different perspectives, and then they would kind of summarize the whole thing and assess the situation. So it was kind of like a yearly update on the state of the world. And it wasn't a social point of view. It wasn't about society. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about spirituality. So it was primarily looking at it kind of more from that point of view. And yet they did look at the political and social angle to the extent of saying, what kind of changes would we need to bring about in our civilization to address these issues at the level that they really need to be addressed on? And then they also kind of keep reassessing, are we on track? Are we making those kind of changes? And that's a kind of an example, I think, of an awareness of kind of staying in touch with an aspect of our karmic situation. One of the ways that we encounter this in spirituality in a very grounded, simple way is that each of us has what could be called a karmic situation. And by that, I don't mean just sort of like Sometimes people have a negative view of karma, but karma actually can be a whole spectrum from difficult, painful, very limiting forms of karma to sort of middle-ish, average types of karma to lofty, sattvic, or subtle kinds of positive kinds of karma. So our karmic situation isn't just about restriction and negativity. It's about the total kind of condition of our personality, the elementals that make up our nature and condition our lives. It reflects in our health conditions, our level of vitality. Excuse me. Even the conditions in our life all around us, our work or financial situation, relationships, and so on. All of that is our karmic situation. So, for instance, if we're, as an example, in a state of meditation, we can experience, in a sense, differentiating in our awareness two basic aspects of our being: our state of presence, which is more attuning to our soul nature. It's our essential consciousness and the essential qualities of our consciousness, the depth of our ability to be content and equanimous and compassionate. And then there are the thoughts that are around and the emotions and desires and our physical condition. And what we'll discover as an example of really kind of understanding what we're calling here our karmic situation. So soon discover that we can't just effortlessly actualize a profound state of presence, say enter into non-dual consciousness and rest in our Atman or Rigpa, the view, and just radiate. We immediately start to feel, and we'll sense it, we'll experience, there's something to deal with here. There's obstruction, there's something, some veil. Sometimes it's very acute. Sometimes we'll feel a sense, let's say, of a strong emotional tone. Maybe we'll feel sort of engulfed in a feeling of a negative self-image, for instance, or some thoughts that are obsessing us that we have a hard time letting go of, or depression. And we can be very present. We can get some skill at really being able to be accepting of those conditions, being mindful and present to them. And still, they don't just go away. They're still there. They condition our total state. And gradually, by deepening our state of presence and other forms of spiritual practice, those karmic conditions will be illuminated and transformed and liberated, so that eventually they're not obstructing our realization and our actualization of our spiritual nature. But one of the things I think is very much a part of self-knowledge and deepening our own, in a sense, our spiritual education is we begin to become familiar with our karmic situation. It's kind of an environment. It's like we're in a room, and to many of us, that room is mostly, we're in the dark. We don't really know what's in the room. So in our spiritual practices, it's if we're sitting down and we have a little light bulb in our hands, and we gradually increase the light of that light bulb, and we start to vaguely make out what's in the room. Oh, I didn't see there's some furniture around. There's stuff in this room. Oh, there's a bookshelf. Oh, there's other people around, and so on. And as the light bulb grows, we see all that more and more clearly. It's all illuminated. Some of these things come and go, so we might feel irritated or anxious in a given moment, for instance. That's part of our current karmic situation. And the next day, it's gone. So at that level, there's a part of our karmic situation that's more fluid. At another level, though, we discover a dimension of our karmic situation that's more permanent, that's more substantial. And it's not ultimate truth, These are changing, impermanent, relative phenomena, our karmic situation. Our true nature is something much more um, transcendent, if you will. But our relative nature, our karmic situation is in flux. And yet, let's be realistic, it's not going to just change suddenly, and it deeply conditions our life. I've used the analogy before. We may idealize, even get glimpses of the actual state of consciousness in which we can perceive the material world as consciousness itself, and as permeable, and as uh, malleable to our own consciousness, so that, for instance, I can look at the walls of the floor, and if the realization is deep enough, I can interact with those realities in such a way as to, say, walk through a door. If I can do that, my karmic situation is very refined, the limitations are minimalized, and I can not only use my body in a much more expanded way, but I can even impose that on the environment. But that's an ideal that most of us haven't realized, and it's very easy to find out very quickly how far one is away from that if one goes and tries to walk through the door. Immediately we discover, oh, that's a karmic limitation. That's not only real for me, it's extremely tangible. It's very, very substantial. The rest of our karma is like that too. Our emotional states, our mental states, our karmic history of memories and the elementals that were generated around them. It's just as substantial as that door that I can't walk through yet. But the beauty of the Dharma is that it awakens in us the realization, the hope, the intuitive sense that it is possible to be liberated. It is possible to gain that freedom, freedom from suffering, freedom from confinement or limitation. But in a sense, a step along the way is we have to come to terms with that karmic situation. So for those of us who are interested in the world situation, our spiritual path then is not only one of spiritual awakening to our deeper possibilities, learning to attune to those realities and to actualize them, to deepen our state of presence. And as part of that process, to become familiar with our karmic limitations, to recognize them, to become wiser, to see the ways in which we hold ourselves back, the way we generate suffering for ourselves, limitation, and to see it happening, to be clear about it, to face it, and to work with it, to skillfully love and transform, and ultimately illuminate this karmic reality that we've co-created for ourselves, that is our personality and our lives as we live it. A lot of it's very invisible. That's one of the basic challenges of our spiritual life is we don't see very easily. Being beings in material bodies, we don't see these thoughts, these elementals, these karmic energies, these memories, and so on, as living realities. And so they don't seem very substantial. And it's hard to get a feeling that they're holding us back. And therefore, it's easy to sort of fool ourselves into thinking, oh, this isn't so hard, this spiritual awakening thing. We can get overly idealistic and think it's going to happen quickly. It is a very real thing that we can awaken. But as we grow in recognizing our karmic situation, we begin to be a little more realistic. We don't want to go the other way and become depressed and pessimistic and despairing and feel that, oh, this can never happen for me. I'm so far away. One of the negative side effects of reincarnation theory in an understanding in cultures that have it, like India, is some of the population unfortunately uses it as sort of like a rationalization for not practicing. Oh, so many lifetimes I'm so far away from liberation. Why bother even practicing? I'll just give money to the sadhus. I'll do some rituals to Kali or Durga or Shiva, and I'll just accumulate some better karma. And then thousands of years from now, I'll start to meditate and work on awakening, because that's just, we don't want to go in that direction and think our karmic situation is so overwhelming and burdensome that we could never make progress. But we don't want to go the other way either and think that there's no substance there, there's no challenges, there's no karma that needs to be dealt with. That's part of our karmic situation. There's a middle path there. We find out what the truth is. We discover both our deeper potential, and we experience more and more our capacity for awakening and healing and transformation. And we get grounded and realistic about the truth of our situation. So for those of us who are not only on a path of individual awakening, but are on a path of service, we're also need to be aware of the world around us. And we develop, just as we have a kind of story of our own awakening. In a sense, that's a fundamental part of being human, is we're story builders. We either subconsciously create stories, or we consciously create stories, but we're always having a narrative. What's happening in my life? It could be a simple narrative with the main theme as well. My goal is to become wealthy, and how's that story going? And this is what's happened today, and this is what's happened yesterday, and this is what I want to try to do tomorrow. It's a story of our lives. Sometimes the story doesn't fit reality very well, but it's our narrative. And we will get wiser by experiencing how well our narrative fits reality, because reality will give us feedback. If it doesn't fit so well, we'll find that out sooner or later. And, sometimes spiritual teachings will say, drop the stories, no stories, live in the moment. Don't think about the past. Don't think about the future. Well, that might work well if you're a renunciate. And not only that, the essence of your story is just dropping all stories. So that's your story, which is, it's really not a possibility to truly drop all stories, but you can kind of minimize them if you want. My understanding of awakening, though, is that it's not incompatible with stories. You simply don't become attached to the story. You inevitably have a story. Your body is a story. It's a living story. Your mind is a story. So you can't not have stories. That's just being part of relativity. But you can become detached from that story, and you can illuminate your story. So being on the spiritual path is in part experiencing and co-creating a story for yourself about what's happening. When we embrace the idea, for instance, that spiritual evolution is possible, we've changed our story. If we integrate that and make that a central thing in our lives, we've brought the spiritual story to the center of our narrative about what our life is about. And if we're servers, then we're kind of extending the story, and we're including more than ourselves in our story of what are we doing? What's the purpose of our lives? What is the narrative that we're part of and that we're trying to make a positive contribution to? So, for instance, when we use words, or spiritual teachings use words like God's will or the plan, for example, these are part of the story. That's part of the story that's about where this is all going. But of course, ideas and ideals, plans and purposes about the future are always embedded in the present. You can't separate the plan from what's already happened and what's currently happening. So generally, whether we call them world servers or light workers or bodhisattvas or those on the path of the Christ principle, those who are interested in a path of service always have some kind of story going on. So in a sense, that's basically what we're talking about, is what is the story of our world situation right now. And what's my place in that? How do we relate to the world as it is? What are the deeper potentials that are happening? What resources can we draw on to contribute to the story within ourselves and our allies? So there's an ongoing challenge for people on a path like that to keep enlightening and maturing our story about the world around us. And that has layers to it, of course. It can be about our family, primary relationships in our life, about our work, about the nation that we're part of. If you're somebody that's, joined the local government in your town, you run for, city council or something, now the narrative about the town becomes very big for you. So that's an aspect of the larger story that we're part of, which is, the universal story is just the universe. We're all part of that. What's the big story? So essential cosmologies in any of the traditions of the world, whether they're philosophical traditions like Plato and Kant, or their spiritual cosmologies, Buddhism or Christianity, they generally have a universal story. What is the story of what's the nature of the universe? Where did it come from? Why is it here? Where is it going? And then it comes all the way down to all the little stories that were part of the sub-stories. And a basic unit now that we've all become aware of in the last several hundred years is that we actually live on a planet. That's somewhat of a new idea generally. So now we can have a planetary story. Arguably, there are beings that have been around for a while that have known this for longer periods of time, but most cultures haven't had much of a sense of the notion of what a planet is, how it's different than a star, the notion that, say, when you see Venus in the sky, you're looking at another planet. People, for the most part, didn't know that 1,000 years ago. So this basic kind of concept of a planet, and therefore being able to have a planetary story, that's, in a sense, that's part of the current story of humanity. Is our planetary story now has as part of its story that we are becoming aware of the planetary story. That's a part of the story. But it happens to be arising at a time when part of what we're becoming aware of is, as human beings, something has happened to humanity in the last 1,000 years. It's really something that's been growing gradually. But a basic part of the story, as I experience, and I think this is not a big stretch to see this, is if we look at the average human being on the planet and how the average person has changed in the last 1,000 years, a basic difference is the average person is much more educated than they used to be. Several hundred years ago, things like the printing press were invented. And as a result of that, within 50 years, tens of millions of books were printed in Europe particularly. And this just changed humanity. It made education more readily accessible to a larger number of people, made the dissemination of information easier. It made the growth of science possible. An explosion of mind has taken place on the planet in the last several centuries. And it led to science and technology, which is kind of a feedback loop. The more you create that, the more you can disseminate information. So the average person has heard words like black holes, which 150 years ago, nobody even knew existed, much less was part of popular language and concepts. So there's this explosion of mind taking place on the planet. By that, I don't mean that we're talking about necessarily a spiritual awakening. People are becoming more intelligent. At the same time, another story is happening. That's a story of a spiritual awakening that's happening in the world. In that story, there's several dimensions to it as I see it. One is that the sheer number of people interested in spirituality on the planet right now has grown enormously. And part of that is largely due to population growth. It's pretty much a product of, at least in part, the reality that there are almost 8 billion people in the world now. And so it makes it possible for larger numbers of people, more people than the larger percentages of people interested in spirituality. But it's also because knowledge of different kinds of spirituality is accessible to a larger number of people. So more people are interested in deeper kinds of spirituality because that information, that awareness of that possibility is widely available now. So, for instance, I think about 20 years ago, there was a big gathering in Thailand where a large pagoda Buddhist stupa was built, a structure, and then around it, a place for people to meditate. And they did sort of a world call, and they gathered 250,000 people who meditated together for several days for world peace. Something like that just hasn't happened, probably in known history. 250,000 people meditating like that. Or in Rangoon, there's a meditation center that was established in the last century, established in the early 20th century and grew and grew. And by the 1960s, tens of thousands of people a year were going to the center and meditating. And so that by that point in time, maybe around 1970, 600,000 people had done meditation intensive retreats at the Rangoon Meditation Center. So massive amounts of interest in spirituality are developing in the world. At the same time, though, the average person is still not that interested in spirituality. So it doesn't mean there isn't a story of change and transformation going on there as well. But they're in some ways distinct stories. Of course, they're interrelated. But the percentage of humanity that's deeply engaged in spiritual awakening is very different than the percentage of humanity that is going, in a sense, more through a kind of mental awakening. They're shifting from being kind of mythic, somewhat more astral, somewhat rational. It's not that people haven't been rational for thousands of years, but the strength of rationality and the degree of informedness of that rationality was different in the past and varied from culture to culture and person to person. But there's an explosion of that going on. So now when we think about our diets, for instance, there's all this information about, the scientific knowledge of how healthy specific things are, and you've got to get this and you've got to get that, and if this turns out to be bad for you now, and so on and so forth. This information mostly wasn't available, even 100 years ago, much less 1,000 years ago. So people are much more informed about those kinds of things. But another issue has arisen because of this. So I'm gonna break down my discussion of what's happening in the world into a few different areas, different stories. And this is one of the ways that I've kind of integrated in myself and reconciled my visionary experiences of global awakenings with my awareness of the general karmic situation and the crises that we're in as a civilization and on the planet as a whole, ecological concerns and so on. In a sense, for me, the way that these all kind of integrate is that they are interrelated but somewhat distinct stories coexisting at the same time. It's not one story. It isn't either or. Either we're having a big global crisis and a sixth planetary extinction event, and that's the story, or we're having a spiritual awakening, or we're having a cultural revolution, or evolution in other social areas like gender equality or civil rights, or there's a bunch of different stories happening at the same time, and we can't define the total world situation by any one of these stories by itself. They're all happening at the same time, and of course they're interrelated. So I'm going to talk for a minute about the one story because it sort of has to do, well, actually, perhaps I'll start with a more fundamentally spiritual story, if you will. And that is, what have I grown personally, for instance, to feel like I've been experiencing when I've had peak experiences? You know, one I mentioned in my autobiography that was posted at the website for a while was an experience back in the 80s where in meditation, I was actually listening to the sound current and I spontaneously entered a superconscious state where I was not only out of my body, but I was out of my personality as a whole, because I didn't have any form in the ordinary sense. There was no subtle body either. I was just pure consciousness, pure soul presence. And so the nature of time and space was different there, but not so much so that there was no space at all. I just didn't have a form in that space. And I was looking at the planet from a distance, but I was looking at the planet multidimensionally. The planet was not only a physical form, and I was somewhat aware of the planet as like a sphere. But much more strongly in my awareness was a sense of the energy and consciousness of the planet. The planet was made up of many colors. They were moving about in a kind of geometry of swirling energy. And the energies were conscious, and they represented just the total situation of the planet, the total beingness of the planet, the soul and subtle forms and dimensions of the planet, as well as its physicality. And so in that state, being in a state of soul consciousness and relating to the soul of the world, I felt vividly aware of an awakening happening within the earth. And so strong was that awareness that I was kind of stunned. I was in a state of awe. It was just as if I was walking to the edge and looking out at the Grand Canyon or some other spectacular view in nature and just in a state of awe. There was no compelling feeling of, something's wrong and we need to fix it. It was more a state of appreciating the beauty of what was unfolding in the earth at that time. And I could sense a sense of time. There was a sense of, it was clearly more of a soul sense of time in that I was aware of the past and the future as like present realities at the same time. And yet the present stood out as well. I was experiencing the earth right now in its soul story, its present state. Over the years, integrating experiences like that, what I've come to feel is that we really are in a multifaceted condition at the same time where there are several stories going on. And that state that I was witnessing of a fundamental spiritual awakening is true for a portion of humanity and a portion of the planet, but it's not true for everybody. A lot of people are in other states of consciousness, and they're growing and they're going through changes and they're evolving in their own way as human beings, for instance, to speak only of the human kingdom for the moment. But they're not directly part of that story that I was witnessing at that moment. In a sense, when you look at things from the soul point of view, it's kind of I could call it a tantric perspective, in the sense that always within every situation, there's a part of the nature of every being that no matter what they're going through, there's awakening happening. There's evolution of consciousness. So if you look at the form side of a person or even an animal or another life form, you can see ups and downs. You can see pain and struggle. You can see periods of actually even apparently going backwards. And so if you focus primarily on that, there's successes and failures, there's ups and downs, there's fulfillment and suffering and loss. If you attune to the deeper essence of the soul consciousness within all forms, there's always learning going on through that experience. So in a sense, I don't feel like in the experience I just described that I was only seeing that part of the planet and that part of humanity that was awakening. There was also an appreciation of the general process of collective evolution happening from that soul perspective. But we also do need to honor, the karmic reality of human beings collectively as humanity, where our personalities are at collectively, what karma we're going through, what the world situation is, what other kingdoms in nature, other life forms are going through. And that gives us a more complete perspective as well. So for me, as far as an aspect of that powerful awakening, that was one experience. I was having regular experiences, especially peak experiences during that period of initial opening to all of that. That's continued during my life, but was particularly sort of, in a sense, what's happened past the 80s was, you could say in a sense, that was the breakthrough period where I opened to those dimensions and those perspectives. And what's been happening since then is refining an understanding of what that means and integrating it with other points of view and developing a more complete and holistic perspective, which in some ways has been challenging, incidentally, because it's kind of been like a koan. How does all this fit together? At times that it has seemed contradictory and confusing, the various points of view. But as I've integrated more, my human nature and relative nature has integrated and balanced increasingly over the years, then my perspective of the planet has expanded. And as my ability to face suffering, to face negativity, has deepened. To really understand the human situation, we have to face things about the world, about ourselves, about what's happening in the world. Because if we have an aversion to including difficult things in our point of view, we won't make that part of our appraisal of what's happening in the world. Our story will be lopsided. So there's a way in which, in fact, in a certain sense, only the most radically advanced planetary masters who have a capacity to look at the full spectrum of consciousness on the planet, from the deepest, most hellish states to the most lofty heavenly realms and everything in between. If you can face all of that with equanimity, be neither attached to any particular dimension or state, nor averse to it, then you can have an unbiased perspective of the total situation on the planet and really understand what's happening. To the extent that we have attachments and aversions to different states of consciousness, we end up in a state where we'll have an increasingly biased perspective of the world situation. So frankly, literally what more advanced initiations mean is, how deeply are you able to face the full spectrum of reality with neither attachments or aversions from a personal point of view? Only compassion, only equanimity. So in that sense, It's really, advanced initiates, sixth, seventh, eighth degree initiates that actually see the planet with the greatest clarity and have the truest story, truest understanding. And it's not necessarily easy to communicate that perspective because, well, first of all, a true version of experiencing that is a very superconscious state. And B, you can't just communicate a perspective to another person if it's based on a depth of wisdom and equanimity that that person doesn't share. They just won't understand. They may intellectually hear what you're saying, but they won't comprehend it truly, intuitively. So mostly what you get are clues, especially from the most advanced practitioners. But we'll come back to that some more later. So although I'm going to go more deeply into this notion, because there's a lot to say about both of these. A simple breakdown would be to say that two of the most important things that I think are happening to the world right now is that there is a spiritual awakening, in fact, going on in the world that's very profound and very significant. There is I would even hesitantly say, it's revelatory in nature. There's a powerful deepening insight into not only opening to spirituality and expressing spirituality in the world that tens of millions of people are involved in, but it's also in an expression of new ways of understanding spirituality that are very healing and important to open to, and is transforming the spiritual traditions of the world, especially those that are more deeply connected to more mystical, more direct realization aspects of spirituality. So that's an important thing that's happening. And another is that we're in a crisis right now because each time a person acquires a new skill or capacity, they have to learn how to use that. For instance, if you don't give a knife to a 3-year-old, obviously they're not ready to handle that. So you wait, and then at a certain point, you start to give them a knife, and then you keep a close eye on them, and you watch how they handle, and it's a test. Maybe they don't handle it well, so you take it away, and you wait another year before they're allowed to have a knife at the dinner table, or to whittle with you in the backyard. So you judge the readiness, and you test that person, etc. In a sense, the explosion of mind that's happened on the planet in the last 1,000 years, particularly the last 500 years, has given humanity a new tool that we call technology. The scope of technology that's now in the hands of humanity is 1,000-fold what it was 1,000 years ago. Enormous power has been released at that level of the intellect and the type of technology that's born out of that type of intellectual expansion. And now humanity has this tool, and it's being tested. How well are we handling that tool? And the evidence that we're experiencing all around us is not so well. We're doing amazingly positive things with it and very destructive things with it at the same time, to the point where we brought our planet into an ecological crisis. And not only that, a variety of other crises that nature would have kept in a greater degree of balance if we had not been using technology to allow ourselves to change our lifestyles in ways where we have new challenges and new possibilities and new problems. So that's another part of the story, is the core story of the human kingdom right now is that we have this enormously enhanced power. It's a power that we can abuse internationally by creating wars. It's a power that we can abuse in terms of discrepancy between the rich and the poor. It's allowed the rich to become richer and create an increasing discrepancy. Technology can be used to mislead people, to mislead the population. It can be used in ways that are unsustainable in terms of the civilization that we live in right now. Was based on a technology that isn't one that's sustainable. So we can't continue to have an industrial civilization unless we make radical changes in where we get our energy from, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of issues. And the root source of that, at least at a certain level of understanding, is there's been a tremendous change in our intellectual understanding of the world, particularly scientifically. And has that change been met with the same amount of growth in emotional maturity and spiritual maturity, so that we can use that power wisely? Has our love and wisdom grown at the same rate as our power has? And what we're in a crisis about right now in the world is, so far, not so much. There's a lot of positives, but also a lot of negatives. And there's still a big question in the balance of how will we handle that crisis. Now, on a soul level, there's a massive learning going on about that. This tremendous awakening that the average person is experiencing by living through the world situation. But how will they implement? How much will that integrate into their personalities and change our lifestyles, change our decisions, change our civilization? That remains to be seen. But in spite of that, there's still enormous wisdom being generated in the soul of humanity, not just in the tens of millions that are involved in a deeper spiritual awakening, but in the average human being. There's a big shakeup going on and a very accelerated growth of wisdom taking place. So obviously there's a more to be said about all of that, but I'm going to pause for the moment and just see if there's any questions or comments at this point. And I guess we'll just use the, unmute yourself if you'd like to, or type it into the chat box. So any questions or comments? Yes. Let's see. There you go.
Yes. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
Well, I didn't want to necessarily take up the space here, but it appeared that nobody else did. So I find it very, very interesting, all this, and also in context of naturally the situation we find ourselves in right now in these times. I'm very inspired from you, and also inspired from Asger. Very interested, has always been very interested in the progress of humanity from, undeveloped souls to super conscious, high developed civilization. And well, first of all, I find it difficult to find anybody that I can actually agree with in terms of what is going on right now. Because it seems like especially in the spiritual community, there's a great deal of miscommunication and a great deal of disagreement on what is going on, and people are actually even, yeah, really misunderstanding each other, and
Mm.
in the dialogues about what is going on and whether one should be pessimistic or optimistic. But I'm kind of interested in your view on this, but also in terms of, uh, is there some of these, let's say, masters or great beings? Like I would agree, I would assume that we have our free will, humanity have our free will to mess up. And I guess that's what you're saying when you're saying like there are dark aspects to what happens, and there are also very positive aspects, and it's all up to us to choose the positives and to embrace the new and leave behind the old. Um, so is there anybody who is kind of like holding our hands, or are we really on our own here? Is it really that we can mess up so badly that we actually end the civilization as we know it, and either the dark side is winning, or uh, yeah. Um, is I would like to maybe, if you have some more like concrete examples of this.
Mm.
Uh,
Concrete examples of,
is there any control of the situation?
I see, yes, yes, who's got their hand on the, okay, I understand. Um, yeah, one of the reasons why it felt like it made sense to include the two other topics of the planetary lineage and the archangelic orders um, is because not only are those, of course, important topics in their own right, but they're kind of essential to understanding the world situation, because it's not just humans and, say, the nature kingdoms that make up the total consciousness of the planet and the world around us. It's also these other types of life, archangels of the elements, a whole variety of other nature intelligences and other types of what we could call archangelic and angelic intelligences, devas, if you will, and also liberated masters and if you will, deities, solar and logi and beings of this sort. So that it does bring up a very interesting question. Um, how much control do they have? Um, when I talk about um, the uh, those kind of primary influences, let's say, that kind of contributing to not only our current situation, but where we go from here, we could break it down into three main things. There's the karma of the world, which plays a role. Like we can't just, same way we can't walk through a door until we're very enlightened, we can't just ignore karma. It's forces that were set in motion in the past that still have to play out, and they're gonna play a role. It's not fatalism or determinism where that's all there is, but it is a factor. The second factor is human beings who have the capacity in the moment to make conscious choices that can rise above their karma and be freer of, they can't ignore, again, can't ignore the karma, but it's another force. It's a force of intentionality, of love, of creativity and inspiration. And that's another potency, another source that we all must draw on. And then the third is other beings, could say allies and partners, beings of with different types of natures. They're not all the same class of beings, but two basic categories would be liberated beings that have been through the human kingdom and are liberated. We're just going to kind of vaguely call them with regard to our planet, the planetary lineage in its various expressions, and just liberated masters in general. And then other kinds of intelligences, and we'll go, in other meetings will go into the finer issues of what are these different kinds of beings and how do they all relate? Do they overlap at all, and so on? But yes, those beings are very much involved. One time I had a dream that shows something, though, about that they have limits too. They're involved, they care, they have a power to affect the world, but they also have limits in how much they can express that power. I had a dream, I think it was back in the 1980s. I was standing next to a lake, and it was a moderate sized lake, and it was kind of to my left, and the bank of the lake kind of curved away. I was standing up near the edge of the kind of curved way around, and then maybe several quarter of a mile on the other side of the corner of the lake, I saw Darshan Singh, and he was surrounded by thousands of people. And I had this strong intuition of like what his purpose was, like the group of humanity that it was his job to relate to. Um, and then in front of me, and somewhat kind of invisible in the sense that they didn't have form, uh, were members of the planetary lineage, hundreds of them. And they were more present as a group than as individuals, but I sensed their individuality, but it was also just the presence of the lineage. And it was enormous. And it was enormously powerful, the presence. And it was, so even though there wasn't form, it was extremely real in a soulful sense. And one of the things, the reason I'm sharing it is one of the things that I felt acutely aware of was that their Shakti, their power, their capacity to love and affect change in the world was staggeringly powerful. It was enormous. And that 90% of it was contained because the karmic situation of humanity did not allow them to express that greater potential for several reasons, but not the least of which is that the main function of the human kingdom is for people to go through experiences, for souls to go through experiences so they can have successes and failures, they can experience different states of consciousness and gain wisdom from it. The primary function of the human kingdom is not to manifest some specific condition in the world. That will naturally come as the human kingdom evolves. More karmically wholesome conditions will arise in the world. The world will become more beautiful, ultimately become heavenly. But that's not the short-term goal. The goal is the evolution of consciousness, the gaining of wisdom, and not, and secondarily, the world will gradually improve. And so from the consciousness and soul point of view, every moment of human evolution is evolution of consciousness. Wisdom is growing. So they don't want to interfere with that. The human kingdom was set up to give people an opportunity to make mistakes, to give people an opportunity to experience darkness, to experience ignorance, to experience confusion, experience desires and attachments and anger and wars and conflicts and struggles and disease. But not just that, positive states as well, so that people can learn, can compare, and can gain wisdom. So you don't go into a classroom where everybody's in 4th grade and say, none of this should be happening. Everybody should be in 6th grade. Why are you doing this? Well, that's where everybody's at. That's what 4th grade looks like. It's a mess. And you don't walk into that and say to those souls, why are you doing this? We're doing it because we're human beings. That's what human beings do. We create messes. We create struggles, we create wars, we create famine, and we create positive states. We create love. We're just a big, messy learning experience in spiritual awakening. So unless things get to a certain point And this is one of the mysteries. There are very advanced beings that are sort of in charge of the situation, if you will. At one level, yes, each human being has free will, and there's a fair amount of license that's given to humanity, individually and collectively, to make mistakes. But there are, to some extent, boundaries. There are limits, and so there are times when, like, there's a phrase in the Secret Doctrine. The Secret Doctrine, by the way, was written primarily by Kuthumi. Probably, my feeling is probably about 70% of the content there is Kuthumi, about 30% Moria, and then Blavatsky inevitably, influenced the way, certainly the language. These Eastern masters, for instance, each has different cultures. So if it's channeling Serapis, you might get certain kinds of language that would include things like Hinduism and Buddhism, but might also include Kabbalah or Neoplatonism. But if it's Swaminarayan talking or Kuthumi, you're more likely to hear terms like yugas, the Kali Yuga and the Satya Yuga, not root races. Root races was a term that Blavatsky invented to translate some of these concepts into English. So Blavatsky had her own influence. That's why in one of the letters, I think Kuthumi and Mori wrote a letter when the Secret Doctrine was done. They said, we are certifying and clarifying that this book is a joint project of me, Moria, Kuthumi, and Blavatsky. So in that book, one of the more unusual esoteric books that have come out in the last 150 years, there's a reference to the notion of the different cycles that come and go in human evolution. And whoever's speaking, the odds are it's probably Kuthumi, said, each cycle, each so-called root race, each yuga has its subdivisions and has its rise and fall and generates civilizations, and then they disintegrate, whole cycles and epochs. And once they've arisen, they start to decline. And when their decline gets to the point where there's too much negativity happening, then that civilization is destroyed and made way for the next cycle. Hence the legends that have been around for thousands of years about ancient civilizations that were destroyed in floods or fires or things like that. So there's debate, needless to say, around right now. Where are we at in this cycle? And the way it was phrased in the Secret Doctrine is it's to arrest humanity's decline in that cycle so that too great a degree of evil isn't attained. Stop that, intervene, say, okay, enough learned in that cycle. Things are following their normal course. You're going downhill now, because it's sort of like a life cycle. People are born, but as they get older, it's common to have a certain kinds of decline. I think even tests show that things like raw mathematical ability tends to peak in your 20s. And even the great scientists and mathematicians, they can still be very strong, of course, in that. And so it's not a problem, but it is gradually declining a little bit as the decades go by. And certainly in other ways, energetically, health, there's a decline. Most people sort of fade out and end an incarnation with increasing health problems and things like that. Where are we at as a civilization right now? Are we in that phase? In the West, there's a lot of discussion of wanting to say again and again, from various sources, we're in a golden age, or we're in a new age. It's an upward cycle. Interesting, though, if you go to the Eastern teachings and look at what people like, Sri Guru Babaji or Maheshwarnath Babaji seem to be indicating, or the Secret Doctrine and some of these other sources, they don't talk so much that way. They talk about being in a Kali Yuga, that things are difficult. Remember, there's in Sri M's autobiography, he talks about one of his encounters with Sri Guru Babaji, where Maheshwarnath is leaving his body about 1985, And Sri Guru makes the comment to Sri M, you'll see how difficult things are going to get. And this is a paraphrase. You'll see how much violence and negativity will arise in the world during your life. He wasn't prognosticating a glorious, he wasn't saying 2012 is going to come and everybody's going to turn into light bodies. He was saying things are going to get worse. Swami Sivananda Radha, a Canadian woman, became a disciple of Swami Sivananda. She actually met Sri Guru Babaji once also, back in, I think, the 50s in India. But she also met Anandamoy Ma, and who told her that she did need to go back to Canada and be a teacher, but she said things are gonna be hard and dark, increasingly so. So I'm gonna dedicate an hour a day of my meditation to helping you, to help protect you and strengthen you against the difficulties that are arising in the world in the decades ahead. So, frankly, I feel like part of that comes from that great initiates like that, Anandamoy Ma or Sri Guru Babaji. They're not ungrounded, samadhi. They have a profound equanimity, a profound willingness to face the shadow side of life. Deeply integrated non-dual enlightenment means you just look relativity in the face, you face suffering, you face evil, and you just have equanimity towards it. Doesn't mean you can't have compassion or a desire to make changes, but the clarity of your wisdom and your capacity to be compassionate is actually directly proportional to the depth of your equanimity. And that means just profound, courageous, seasoned, sobered, grounded, facing truth, facing reality, looking at the whole situation, your own karma, your own nature, top to bottom, other human beings. Blavatsky, for all her wonderful traits, according to Alcott, was in some ways not great at that, personally. He said she constantly made friends with people who took advantage of her. She was always seeing the best in people and not seeing their shadow side as much. She has a reputation of being this fierce kind of warrior type, but actually she was kind of a softie in some ways and a little ungrounded. That's part of what groundedness means, is just having a sober, realistic, facing of human nature, facing of the truth, not sugarcoating it. So the positive beauty of life is there is potential for awakening. There's much goodness in the world, in human nature, and human beings. But we have to balance that by facing the truth of where, the other side of life, the other side of human nature and of samsara, just seeing it with, clarity and courage and honesty. And then we get a realistic picture. And I think the picture that's emerging is collectively, we're in a challenging situation. And that doesn't mean there's no hope. It doesn't mean there isn't potential for change. But there's a number of possible scenarios there. I think we'll wind up and go for a break in a moment. But to conclude this, moment, even the more negative scenarios that are possible. And by the way, sometimes people think of angels as being kind of maybe a little on the light side, maybe even ungrounded in some ways. But that's not necessarily, that can be, depends on the type. But some of those, for instance, that Lorna Byrne, this wonderful Irish mystic that I like to mention sometimes, she's had a lot of interactions with beings, especially archangels, who have, amongst other things, shown her visions and explained to her things about the world situation. And they don't mince words, and they're saying we're in a global crisis. It's very, very difficult. And they've shown her a whole spectrum from very beautiful possible visions of the future to very problematic possibilities of the outcome of the human situation. And so she doesn't like, she's often like, what she calls it giving out, which I guess in Ireland means kind of like, catharting a little, like saying, why are you showing me this thing? Because it's painful to her. Because it's hard to see these things. It's to have equanimity towards everything that's possible or what's true in the world is very difficult and certainly challenging for Lorna. So when they show her these more problematic scenarios, she tends to get upset. She doesn't like talking about it, but she says, they want me to see these things. They want me to talk about these things because humanity needs to know what's at stake. We're in a challenging situation. People need to step up. People need to awaken to the reality of the situation. I have acquaintances in Mount Shasta who, are part of what some people call the ascension movement. The goal is we're all going to turn it to light. We're entering a new age. Everybody's going to have light bodies within the next 20 years. And one of the things I've noticed that goes hand in hand with that way of thinking is a profound intolerance to pain, to aging, to suffering, to the shadow side. One of the people that I'm thinking of that's like this, it's almost across the board an area of resistance. Like, she doesn't like the idea of aging, so she announced to me about 15 years ago that she had achieved immortality and she wasn't aging anymore. Clearly she is. I've continued to bump into her in the area in the last 15 years. She continues to age, but it's just denial. So it's like, I'm not going to deal with suffering. I'm not going to deal with the shadow side. I'm not going to face evil. I'm not going to age. And I'm going to project that onto the world, that the whole world's entering this state. And it's just, that's an extreme version of something that all of us have a tendency to do. And I think it's one of the reasons, as you were saying, that there's disagreement is people have different, some people go the other way. They're totally caught up in the negativity and they have a very pessimistic and negative interpretation. And I don't resonate with that either, although they are facing truths sometimes. They might not see them in the fullest light, or they might be into excessive conspiratory theories and paranoia and embellishment. That's a whole problem too, but that doesn't mean there isn't something there. There's truths to be faced on that side as well. But balance. So that's what I'm going to continue to offer, is a point of view I feel like is my best understanding of a more balanced perspective that can put a number of these things together and have it balance out and refine into a more comprehensive picture. So thanks for the question and the comments, by the way. And why don't we go ahead now and take our break, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. Okay. Welcome back. Before we meditate, and while I'm thinking of it, I wanted to ask, I changed my arrangement for my microphone so that it's closer to me now. And I wanted to just ask if that sounds, two things: does it sound any better? And also, is it too strong? Because on some of the tests I did, it seemed like it might be a little too overloading. So does it sound clear?
It does sound clear. It's very good. And it's a bit louder than it used to be. And before, a couple of webinars back, your
Great.
voice was very low. So it's good now. Very good. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. So sounds good. Thanks for the feedback. Yeah. I put it on a boom so I could put it up closer. You could probably even see it on the screen there a little bit. Great. Good. Glad to hear that that's helping and it's not too loud. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and have a meditation now. Taking a moment to settle in and become more present. And particularly being aware of your body. As your body continues to relax. Just being aware of your body can facilitate your body relaxing and opening as much as possible. Feel your body completely. Hold your whole body in your awareness from your feet to the top of your head. A sense of whole body presence. At the same time, maintaining a state of spaciousness. You're both aware of the concreteness of your body and a sense of openness and spaciousness. Just accepting whatever's there. Any states that remain in your body, if there's any discomfort, just let that be. Releasing, trying to let it go, and just accepting its presence. Any emotional states. Being at peace with whatever's there. Just being aware and embracing. And now turn your attention to the world around you, the world situation. Letting different facets of the world situation flow by. But also accepting not resignation, not an acceptance that stops you from acting when you wish to, but just being able to be at peace at the same time. A deep balance and equanimity. You may feel or notice thoughts arising or emotional reactions to the world as a whole. And just be with those too. Just notice them and let them be. You may feel your body reacting in some way to attuning to the world. Maybe tension arises, uneasiness, and just noticing that too. Although we may be called to action at different points in time, right now we're just deepening our ability to be equanimous, be fully present. You settle deeper into a more balanced, accepting state of consciousness. Feel a sense of wholeness that this brings. Opening to your soul. Being more at peace and content and whole. And feel how living in the world, being part of the world, even that, accessing and resting in presence, helps to heal the world, makes a contribution. And bring your awareness back to your own body. Feeling grounded and present. And when ready, open your eyes. Another part of the world situation that a number of people have asked me to address in a sort of a um, natural topic, given our current situation, is the pandemic. So let's take a moment now to look at that a little bit. A common aspect of our thinking about that, several different dimensions that I think are, or what I encounter in people and when spiritually considering the pandemic, are questions like what's causing this pandemic, how to be with it, and what are we learning from it? In a certain sense, with regard to how to be with the pandemic, it's ultimately not different than any other aspect of the spiritual path, in the sense that the entire spiritual path is really a focus on how to be with life, how to be with ourselves, how to relate. In a sense, one of the key words I like to focus on in terms of understanding the Dharma, the spiritual path, is it's about relationship. How do we relate? There are certain aspects of the Dharma that are kind of more essential beingness dimensions. It's like, for instance, when we talk about a quality like peace or contentment, kind of speaks a little bit more directly to the essence of our core sense of experience. Whereas other qualities like love or equanimity, in some sense, have a stronger emphasis on the relational aspect of the path and of awakening. But even the quality like contentment sort of is interrelated with that, because it's about, for instance, it's interrelated with the quality of equanimity, in that equanimity describes relating to the reality that ordinarily as human beings we have desires and aversions. And equanimity kind of speaks to, in one aspect, releasing personal desires and aversions, coming into balance, letting reality be. And as we do that, what we find, we have these desires and aversions because they're our strategy for how to be happy, how to find fulfillment. And what qualities like contentment speak to is what we discover is in our inherent state of being. If we have equanimity and we release attachments and aversions, in other words, instead of looking out there, if we discover our true nature, if we settle into our natural state, we become more at peace. We feel a kind of indescribable spiritual fulfillment, contentment, joy, and bliss. And every situation that we go through in life is another opportunity to flesh out and bring into our awareness, that give us an opportunity to work on our attachments and aversions. And the coronavirus is no different. It's another situation that, from the kind of personal path point of view, in the deepest, most simple sense, is another opportunity, another situation to, it's part of our curriculum, a part of our learning program, where we're, what does this bring up in me? What issues do I face? What attachments and aversions do I have? So in one sense, understanding the cause of the coronavirus isn't as important. In one sense, the cause of the coronavirus is samsara, ignorance. The universe generates endless drama, endless discomfort, endless ups and downs, temporary pleasures and happinesses and fulfillments, and temporary difficulties and diseases and challenges and struggles. And you can trace back specific ones to a source, like, oh, I see this specific pain that I'm experiencing or emotion that I'm experiencing right now is caused by this attachment. It's true. But in another sense, part of the beauty of the great spiritual teachings of the world is that they kind of illuminate the core issue in such a way that it's not actually necessary to know the why of specific things that we're going through. All we need to know is that suffering will go away if we release attachments and aversions, if we awaken to our true nature, if we realize the truth of reality, which is not different than letting go of attachments and aversions, because our true nature is intrinsically whole. There's no need for desires and aversions when we realize the truth of who we are. So at the deepest level, my deepest response to the question of, what's the coronavirus teaching us, or where did it come from? How do we relate to it is pretty much no different than when we get into a car accident, or someone gets upset with us, or we go to use the computer and our internet is down, or it's all opportunities. Everything is just opportunities to awaken, to flush out our attachments, our aversions, our misunderstandings of reality, and drive us back into ourselves. And do we embrace that opportunity, or do we just create more karma? Do I just go into a big grumpy upset that my internet is down, or do I use it as an opportunity? There's the choice right in that moment. Which way do I go with this? Do I go deeper into myself, or deeper into samsara? Deeper into forgetting who I really am. So coronavirus in many ways is a particularly challenging one, especially in terms of, sort of the sorrow we see in the world around us. By the way, quite a few people have shown concern. I'll take this a little segue for a moment to speak about coronavirus in the US. Yes, things are not great in the United States, as many of you have observed. I get a feeling maybe that it's not quite as bad as the media may be saying, or because we're kind of handling it pretty poorly, but it's kind of in the middle. Like, in fact, I saw an assessment the other day. Some institute kind of did an assessment of the countries and how they're handling coronavirus around the world. And out of almost 200 countries in the world, we were in the 50s, which for a modern civilized first world, all those words, kind of country, that's not a great track record. So I share the dismay that our government and a lot of the people in this country are handling the situation pretty poorly. But it's not the catastrophic situation that apparently some people think it is. In fact, in our state, in Oregon, it's about the same as some countries like Finland or Denmark. It's fairly similar. Other states are handling it or having a much more difficult time. But in Oregon, it's pretty good. And in fact, in Jackson County, the county that we live in, and Siskiyou County, where Mount Shasta is, those are two adjacent counties in Northern California and Southern Oregon. Much better than average. Top, probably that these two counties would be in the equivalent of the top maybe 5% of the way of how different populations are handling the virus. So virus-wise, fire-wise, we've had some very difficult situation, as you all know, in recent months. Coronavirus-wise, our immediate environment is actually doing very well. And there's a lot of other states in the United States that are doing very well also. And then there's states that are sort of middle-ish, and then states that are really struggling. So it kind of averages out to a fairly moderate, mediocre kind of response. But I wish we were handling it better. But it's kind of the equivalent of maybe France, Spain, some of these kind of countries where the US as a whole is kind of in that zone, somewhat kind of middle-ish. One of the things that I think, is in a sense, when these things happen collectively, what people get out of it really actually in part varies from person to person. The lessons to be learned have a lot to do with, some people are learning simple lessons like to don't just think of your own well-being. Maybe you don't feel like you're in a high risk category. Maybe you feel like you're willing to take the risk. But you need to also think about other people. It's not just about you. And these are some of the kinds of lessons that people are learning. Is slowly we see some people, I've seen people in social media, celebrities come out in the early stages and say, rebel against all of the protocols that are being suggested, and say, I'm a risk taker. I just want to live my life. I'm not going to be a fearful person. And then they come around and they realize they need to be thinking about loved ones. They need to be thinking about other people in general. So there's learning going on in many people in a variety of ways, and it depends on the person. For some people, it's just overcoming that. We're, to the extent that people are restricted in their activity, and we have to kind of let go of it. In a sense, in many ways, we're being forced to be a little bit more like renunciates, to renounce things that we used to do more, and learn to let go, learn to be content with a simpler life or a more restricted set of interactions and activities. So a lot of it really, in a sense, it all boils down to the more universal truths of, it's the same lessons. We're learning to go deeper into ourselves and release our false identifications, our desires, our attachments, our aversions, our agendas. And that's this sort of universal spiritual lesson. And as we do that, we become more free, we become more peaceful, we become more compassionate, we become more selfless. And coronavirus is just another opportunity to go deeper into that for each of us. As far as the underlying causes, my feeling is that, in a sense, always the universal truths again stand. It's these karmas are generated by past and current expressions of our imperfections, our attachments and aversions, and then it catches up with us. In fact, there was an interesting interaction. There's a fellow named Archibald Cochrane who had a conversation with Rakatsi, or Saint Germain, who materialized to him in the 1930s. And he was just kind of minding his own business. He's a sort of a Western mystic and esotericist, and did some energy healing work with people and this and that. And kind of a quiet person, not too well known. You probably haven't heard his name before, Archibald Cochrane. But he, towards the end of his life, just suddenly out of the blue, Rakatsi showed up. And he said he was just kind of coming to acknowledge his life work. And but he said one of the things that the reason I'm bringing it up right now is he pointed out something interesting about illness and aging. And he said simply this. He said, if you, and I'm kind of paraphrasing obviously, if you have found inner peace and live a healthy lifestyle, diet and so on, and have worked out your karma, so you don't have past attachments and aversions and the karmic consequences coming into your body and mind and sort of causing stress and pain and so on. If you've worked out your karma and you're also in a state of being in harmony with yourself, you're not at odds with life. You don't need anything personally. You're at peace. No desires and aversions. That if you've attained that state, then your body would naturally live to be about 250 years old. In other words, we wear our bodies out by our attachments and our aversions. Our karma from the past, and which is more attachments and aversions, and our current attachments and aversions create enough stress that we live to be a third or a quarter of what our bodies would normally live to if they just kind of, if our bodies were left in peace to just be the natural organism that our bodies were designed to be, we lived to be about 250. And then with enhanced abilities and consciousness, they could last even longer than that. But without doing anything special, no special breathing practices, etc., they would still last a long time. They're well-designed vehicles that have a lot of resilience and capacity to self-heal and longevity. But, you know, and that's fine. Nobody's like, this isn't a judgment that we should feel bad about ourselves that we we wear our bodies out. But it is a sobering insight to realize, oh, so in a sense, that is always the source of disease, whether it's coronavirus or the common cold or anything. It ultimately comes from that. And so in that sense, it's not actually ultimately necessary to know where specific things come from. We can assume the core, the essential source is that we've forgotten our true nature and engaged in dualistic consciousness and engaged in desires and aversions and all the emotional reactions and stress and so on that comes with that. So conflict, disease, and suffering are the natural outcome of attachments and aversions. That's what the virus is teaching us ultimately in a wide variety of different ways, some of them differing from person to person. Partially, though, I do feel that one of the specific versions of that we've gotten very engaged in modern life is that we have passionately and ambitiously created a modern industrial civilization over the last few centuries. And it's largely generated out of desires and aversions. It's us using our relatively modest newfound knowledge of nature to apply that knowledge in ways to try to make our lives happier, freer of disease. But for the most part, a lot of the strategies that we're using are not very wise. They're not based on a true understanding of the real cause of disease. I think I told this story before. This is kind of a spiritual version of it. Daskalos had a policy where he would apply a healing 3 times. Let's say if he did a healing on somebody and it didn't stick, he would do it up to 2 more times. And then he would say to the person, if it doesn't stick after 3 times, your karma is not ripe yet. So that energy will still be around to help heal you when the time is ripe, when the karma is farther along. And it'll accelerate that process of working through that karma. But if it didn't stick, you still have to work off more karma first. So I met a woman when I was visiting Daskalos in the early 90s, and she was an example of that. Her daughter had severe scoliosis of the spine, and she brought her daughter to Daskalos, and he just straightened her spine out. It was normal. But within a few weeks, it had gone back. So she went back a couple of times. And each time, he just straightened out her spine using sort of like willpower. He pushed it back to where it's kind of like chiropractic, but more intense. And karma pushed it back again. So he said, that's the limit. There's nothing else I can do right now. In a sense, when we use science and technology to try to get rid of things like diseases or to make ourselves happy, but if we're doing that in a way that's really not in alignment with our karma, it's not open to dealing with our karma and healing it, then imagine if you had so much willpower that you could do that to your own spine, you just straightened out your spine, but the karma wasn't done, then in a sense, you may actually be repressing working out that karma. You need to some extent to go through. So that's one of our main strategies as human beings is we don't like to feel suffering, so we repress it. We engage in different behaviors to avoid it. We We engage in use of intoxicants to anesthetize ourselves. We, play games. We hike, and some of the behaviors we do, of course, certainly have a certain degree of positive value for us. So I'm not saying everything humans do is unwholesome, but a lot of it is engaged in either as a form of seeking happiness in ways that aren't very wholesome, or they're avoidance behaviors. And so to the extent that we do that, we're really actually not dealing with our karma. We're avoiding it and we're suppressing it. And in a sense, modern civilization is a collective expression of a massive attempt to prematurely create a much more positive situation for humanity than we've actually karmically earned. The living in the kinds of houses that we live in right now, where we're having the degree of luxury, for instance, that we have, we didn't accomplish that in a wise, ecological, wholesome, and integrated way. We use toxic materials. We fuel them with energies that aren't in balance with nature. And so it's not a coincidence that it's all starting to unravel, because it's not sustainable. It's not holistic. It's not in harmony with nature. And it's not in harmony with our karmic situation. It's really being used to avoid our karmic situation. So we've worked very hard. So let's say a person is a workaholic. So they work really hard to avoid that they have, let's say, some significant emotional issues, and they avoid and work really hard. Eventually, cracks will show up in the situation. Eventually, symptoms will be building up because they're not dealing with it. And in fact, the behavior itself, being driven the way it is, has its own inherent problems in it. Plus, they're not dealing with the emotional problems. And eventually, people that use that strategy tend to run into some kind of wall at some point. And that's true of all kinds of strategies that we have as human beings. We often go about, like if we use drugs to try to find happiness or avoid suffering, it's going to hit a wall at some point. We're going to bottom out. Alcoholism. These are all methodologies that don't work in the end. In a sense, this modern industrial civilization that we live in is one of those. It's a dead end. It's not in harmony with our karmic situation, and it's not a wholesome way for human beings in our current planet, with our current population, with our current karma, to try to be happy. It's a dead end. So the question is not, can we somehow fix this current civilization? It's more fundamental than that. We need to readjust to a more appropriate, more balanced, more wholesome approach to living as human beings, and accepting our current state of karma and finding the wisest ways to live in harmony with that situation and with the planet. And in that context, coronavirus to me is in part the feedback the planet's giving us that we're out of balance. One of the many feedbacks that we're getting, that we're not living in harmony with ourselves or the planet. So if we get more specific about what coronavirus means, I feel like it's in that general category. It's especially when things have a more collective manifestation, something that's affecting the entire. It's affecting millions of people's health. It's affecting the economy of the planet and so on. This is sort of more a reflection of collective karma as well as personal karma, and so it's kind of reflecting a more general message about how we live more broadly as human beings on the planet. So that doesn't mean there isn't hope that we can't make adjustments to our civilization, that we can't get back on the right track. But it's probably going to be a difficult road to that, because there's a lot of resistance, a lot of inertia, a lot of attachment to Yeah, we'd have to kind of go, I think, somewhat back to a simpler kind of lifestyle, not pre-technology, but a more appropriate kind of technology, something that's more sustainable, more in harmony with nature, and more in harmony with our own state of consciousness, our own karmic situation. So I'll shift now and ask, open up to whether people have any comments or questions about this point.
I have a question.
Yes.
The difference in how the countries are managing the difference or the corona, how they use their power or their influence to do different things. Are those karmic structures as well? Do you understand what I'm saying?
You say a little bit more. I think yeah.
Let's say, for example, some countries have closed down completely, closed everything down. Mm-hmm. And for example, in Sweden, a lot of things has been open and we haven't closed down anything in such a drastic way. And there's a spectrum of how countries have managing the corona. Is that karmic structures and influences on the country or the levels of the country or something like that?
I think I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, it's in one sense, it's sort of like the two main influences on a kind of grounded level in human experience are our past karma, which is not just things like we often think of karma as more like a reward and punishment system. One form of karma could be, let's say, if we were a kind person in the past and developed generosity. Now, those are positive, virtuous karmic elementals in our nature and will make us more likely to be that way in the future. So in future lives, might be a 5-year-old child that happens to be more generous. That's karma from the past, a positive spiritual karma. So part of it is, what's the momentum in a country like? What's the history of that country? What's its ancient and more present karma of how do you deal with stuff? What's the outlook? What's the policies and so on? And that's going to be a reflection of the people as a whole. And also then there's the current thing. How are people in that aspect of their nature that's not just wedded to karma, but can sort of step back and say, is there a fresh perspective? I can be a little freer and more creative and look at this in new ways. So that can play a role. That's not that well developed in humanity. It's there, but it's not the dominant. Daskalos once made the observation, human beings are on the whole about 80% subconscious and instinctual rather than conscious and, exercising free will and reason and spaciousness in their approach to things. That's more kind of reactive, more from the gut. So that's there, but it's going to be mostly the latter, the momentum of the way, and then learning, subtle changes are hopefully happening sometimes for the positive. The U.S., for instance, it's been very up and down. Starting back in the 60s, there was a big swell of interest in ecology, for instance, and throughout the 70s, enormous optimism and changes, policies being implemented, looked very optimistic. And then the backlash, is then the shadow side reacts. Like if you go too far a certain direction, then the other side gets stirred up. And then Reagan was elected in 1980 and started undoing a lot of that. And it's been a struggle like that ever since. And now we're having another backlash reaction. This one even worse than the last one. So it's back and forth. But the U.S. is a very complicated population. So there's a lot of different states of consciousness a lot of different types of people. And each type, there can be tens of millions of that type just in the same country. And yet they're still not the dominant influence, even though there's tens of millions of them. So many of us feel like we're kind of along for the ride, where we're not represented at the status quo or collective level as we're an influence, but we don't tend to get our way. Even when some of the better leaders are elected, they weren't necessarily always our optimal choices, but they do just sort of represent the karma of the country. Yeah. So does that touching upon the?
Yeah, especially the first part of, yeah, but it was really good. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
I have one more.
I would have one. Oh,
Okay. I think did I hear Lars
Great.
first, or not sure?
I'm here. I can't really hear. Is anybody else talking?
Yeah.
Yes. Who wants to go first? You guys work it out. Okay, Lars, you're on my screen at the moment. I'm not sure why, but why don't you go
Okay.
ahead and.
I don't see you. Okay.
What's that?
that's,
I'm going to turn you up.
Actually, two questions, and the first one is related to your response to Hans Christian, and so I was, in short, you are painting an image of the humanity going kind of downwards, so to speak, in a way, and it was. I would like you to perhaps explain a little bit how you look at it, because what I have heard before so far has been kind of we are approaching slowly the first initiation of the human population, or planetary first initiation and so forth, and the coming of the Christ as a mass initiation, the first initiation related to that. And I actually just saw that Thich Nhat Hanh, who has his birthday today, said that the coming Buddha might be a collective Buddha. So it tastes something like the what we have learned from Alice Bailey. So I would like you to explain a little bit how this point of view as something like a crescendo going upwards, and in a spiritual realization in the humanity, and then this Kali Yuga, bad times, so to speak, point of view, how you look at those two things. So that was the one important one. And then the other one is to something you just said. And this is about kind of the spiritual understanding that, for instance, if you have, any health issues or something happens in your life, then it's karma, and then you will of course try to deal with it. But how do we kind of when do we avoid the karma? For instance, is taking antibiotics, is that kind of avoiding karma, or should we kind of just get that infection fully and let the body take the full load, so to speak? And so that's a kind of an example of what I was thinking of. But it's
those are
just
two really easy questions to talk about in the next 8 minutes. Those are great questions, and I would love to address them fully. I'm going to respond briefly to each one because there's a couple of other folks with questions too, and we want to dip in there as well. But I will say first that the first question, for instance, that's worthy of like a whole meeting at least, if not, and we'll see how much time we decide to go into that. But I will definitely return to that because that's kind of what I was referring to, that whole issue of what does it mean that not only people like Bailey or Aurobindo or others like that have seen kind of visions of some kind of collective awakening, but I've had experiences of it myself, some of them very kind of super conscious radical states. So it's been a koan for me to kind of integrate that with other points of view that feel like they have some merit as well. So I will come, I'm going to really treat that. I'm going to mostly just come back to that next time, probably next time that we meet. But I will say that there's a way that I believe that both could be true at the same time, but it means modifying both perspectives. And that's where I'll leave it like at that point for now. As far as the second question, that's huge too. That's very advanced question, really. The short version, a short version of a response to that would be, we don't really ever ultimately know the full extent of our karma, or usually how ripe it is for healing. So we should just go ahead and try to heal it. And there's various methods that can be used. Some can go a little too much in the direction of avoidance or repression. So we want to find a middle path there between working through our karma and accepting our karma. And at the same time, it's appropriate to take positive measures to improve it. And so there's a way to combine the two strategies that's balanced and doesn't err too much in one direction or the other. And it's a great question. So I'll again come back to that more in the future because I think it's relevant to the world situation as well. So thank you for those questions. And let's see who, there was at least a couple of others that popped up. Somebody else that had a?
I have one, Mark. There's
yes.
Yeah. Try to do this very shortly. It pertains mostly to the first segment of this session. So the universe is of course is terrible. There's so much suffering, there's so much violence, so much activity, and so on. And we live in that, and we know that as human beings. At the same time, you talk about all these stories. I mean, we have to have a story, but I think there's also a survival mechanism in these stories, especially the spiritual stories. In psychology, some version of psychology talks about something called a double bind as a root cause of certain forms of schizophrenia. The double bind, very shortly, meaning that the child needs a positive relationship. It's existentially, biologically, psychologically, socially fully dependent on the parent or the adult, and it needs the adult to be good and nourishing. If that adult then abuses the child, it then has the double bind of both needing mother to be good and experiencing that mother is bad. I believe that every human being on the planet suffers from a massive double bind pertaining to our mother, the universe, who is the horror. I mean, look at what's happening as we speak now. You know, there are child factory workers in Bangladesh, animals suffering, children being abused in this very moment. And we all know this, yet we have to believe that mother is also good. So how do we reconcile the fact that, you know, our cosmic mother is eating at us? It is the abyss eating at us at every moment. At the same time, the mother is also the opportunity for awakening and love. It is the beauty of nature. It is companionship. You know, schizophrenic means schizo, it's split. And how do you reconcile that split? And is the only kind of version of that reconciliation awakening to non-duality and saying, you know, it is what it is. You can't judge it. And second, just if that is the truth, and if we're going towards, equanimity, then why do people always talk about the light as a goal and the good stuff as a goal? I mean, we learn from suffering. That's a main driver in evolution. You started the meditation by wishing peace on the planet. If suffering and friction of violence is the driver of evolution, why not wish for that? It's just
Good question. Thank you. Yes, both are interesting points. By the way, you look like you're about to take the rainbow body, so maybe I'm just joking, but I see your back screen thing is on. As far as the first thing goes, briefly, of course, because this is a big topic. The question of how to relate to the universe reminds me of a vision that Ramakrishna had, where he was a lifelong devotee of the goddess Kali, and had a profound connection, of course, with Kali. And one time he said to Kali, "Could you manifest in a way and show me, reveal to me your true nature?" And he entered a superconscious state and he saw a vision. And Kali took the form of a mother goddess, a female, walking up out of the river. And as she was walking, she became pregnant, gave birth to a child, suckled it at her breast, and then devoured it, showing the whole cycle of life of creation, sustaining, and destruction in one archetype, in one reality. And of course, that's the koan that she transmitted, this sort of complete truth. And I think for me, what she was communicating was what I would call a non-dual truth, which is that basic archetypes like good and bad don't absolutely pertain to the ultimate nature of reality. Kali is a deity archetype that is a kind of non-dual deity. It's revealing this kind of radical, the sort of destructive goddess like Shiva energy of Kali is about that you need to just have the most radical dissolution of illusion. And that includes projecting onto reality that it's good. And the paradox, and this is, a great koan, a great paradox in reality, is awakening to that truth, awakening to the reality that samsara isn't good or bad. It just is a good thing to experience. Not because the universe designed it to be that way. It's just liberating. It's the suffering, your suffering ends if you accept the reality that Buddha nature, the true nature of everything, call it Brahman, the Tao, what have you. If you awaken to this transcendental truth that transcends polarities of all sorts, including good and evil, then you experience bliss, you experience wholeness, you experience luminosity. Not because that's the nature of the reality that you're opening to. That's what you experience when you realize that that's the truth. And that's different. Those two different things. So it's a very difficult koan. It's been said that non-dual philosophy truly is the most difficult of the spiritual philosophies to understand, because it's in a sense, it's like climbing a ladder, the ladder of spiritual awakening. If you are on a certain rung of the ladder and there's many more rungs to go, it's a lot easier to understand the rungs that are just above you. They're inspiring, they're within reach, they're within comprehension. But one of the problems that happens with the rungs that are farther away is that not only are they harder to reach, that the glimpses of them that we have, often we usually misunderstand because we're not close enough to them to understand them properly. So we get confused. And non-dualism is like that. It's one of those high rungs that almost invariably gets misunderstood. And one of the common misunderstandings of it seems like it's sort of like a stark, depressing, boring. There's a lot of ways that people react to it emotionally. And it's actually none of those things. Those are all misunderstandings. It's the most deeply satisfying, mysterious, awe-inspiring, liberating, joyous realization. But it only will be experienced that way if you're at the proper rung. Before that, hopefully you'll have a proper, at least a balanced sense of it. But more commonly, people will get confused philosophically, emotionally. They'll have different kinds of reactions to it. Subsequently, in some traditions, it's felt like it's better not to talk about this. Let's just leave this for later. You'll love it later. Right now, it's dangerous. You might get confused. You might get upset by it. You definitely will misunderstand it. So let's just leave it for later. But the problem is the cat's out of the bag now. Everybody knows about this. It's out. So we have to we have to address it and try to do damage control and try to present as balanced a picture of it. But it's difficult because it is difficult to understand. So that's where I'm going to stop for now. Both of your questions are very profound, and we'll come back to them. Feel free to bring it up in the future, but I want to get to one more question. We're a bit out of time, so but thank you for and we'll come back. Back to my yes. So one more question I think I saw before. Is that Hans Christian or Nina? Nina? Yes.
Yeah, but I think we're getting very late now. Yeah, I love both Lars's and Rune's questions. And my original question is, I think, too large. It related to cosmic kundalini and awakening of the planets. And
well, how about this? Why don't you tell it to me, and then I will write it down.
Maybe I will just email the question because it's a little complex. But I have a short question. I can you can answer maybe because you mentioned Anandamaya. Yeah, you mentioned Anandamaya Ma, and I have felt quite strong visions about her some years ago. I felt her very, very dear, like very intimate with her. I had very long period of time, and I was wondering if you have any like insights about her relationship, maybe to the lineage, because I heard there is a person who claims he's a Kriya Yoga teacher also. I think he's called Gurunath Siddhanath. He has written books about, also he claims he has met Babaji and so forth. And he claims that Anandamaya Ma is like an embodiment of Sri Devi, like Babaji's twin flame or twin sister, that Anandamaya Ma is like an incarnation of Sri Devi. And I don't know anything about that, but just that there was this like super deep recognition about her. Also, when we went to India to Varanasi, where he used to live in, we went to her ashram, and she has this amazing quality of shining our true essence, so that you like feel almost like you are her. Of course, I don't mean in a personality level, but she's so somehow I think her archetype is so pure somehow that she's reflecting mirroring somehow our self, so that there's something so magical about her. But I have never really felt like how is she really connected to the lineage as such. Only I feel my love for her. So if you know more about her, it would be wonderful to hear.
Great. Well, again, briefly, one thing I'll say is that something that people often don't realize when they've encountered the idea of the planetary lineages, they have images of great souls like Sri Guru Babaji or Hilarion Serapis. And so there's an image that's developed that these people are largely behind the scenes. And that's true, except that what's often not understood is that not all, but many of these same individuals also have incarnations, sometimes simultaneously, where they're out in the world as well. And they don't necessarily, because they weren't initiated into the behind the scenes world and trained in that way, they don't live necessarily to be hundreds of years old or have the same perspective or even the same job, so to speak. But they are actually expressions of that same individual, which, it sounds like this person felt that was true of Anandamaya Ma and Sri Devi. I've never specifically had that feeling, although it interests me, so I will investigate. But I did have the feeling, though, more generally, that she was one of the great ones, and that was more of an outer world manifestation, but that she actually was see, some people can get to levels of, say, third, fourth, fifth initiation, and they're not destined to be on a sort of more extended experience of being on the path of earth service, or let's say even if they have bodhisattvic inclination, it may take them elsewhere. So around some initiation, like the third, fourth, or fifth, typically, they might transition to some other kind of work and not be part of this planetary lineage. So when you look at a specific individual, let's say like Darshan, they may or may not be. But in her case, I think that's been my feeling for a long time, is that she is part of the planetary lineage in that deeper sense. So that's all I'll say about that right now. Thank you very much for the question. I look forward to your email about cosmic Kundalini. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Feel free. I'll say to everybody, I'll repeat, the invitation if people have questions that they'd rather share in emails. Feel free to use that method as well. And thank you all for coming today. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.